Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about the, as you said, a timely issue, presidential power in Iran and its implications for U.S. Iran relations. As most of you know, over the past weekend, the new Iranian President Hassan Rouhani took office, replacing the provocative and troublesome Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who had been president for the past 8 years. Many of us are wondering what the implications will be, what changes will take place within Iran, and how that will affect U.S.-Iran relations. And I'd like to talk to you about that today, and hopefully answer more of your questions in the question and answer session. Now, Hassan Rouhani's victory on June 14th came as a shock to many, or most, Iran watchers, including myself. Many Iran watchers had assumed that the hardliner and nuclear negotiator Saeed Jalili was a frontrunner for the presidency. He was considered to be the supreme leader's favorite, and many pundits were expecting for the vote to be rigged in his favor. In fact, as a result of the election, it's apparent that there had been little tampering of the election itself. It appears to have been relatively fair within the confines of the Islamic Republic system, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Now that Rouhani is in office, many are optimistic about the changes he'll bring. From the domestic standpoint, he had promised in his campaign and speeches after his election that he will improve the economic situation within Iran with better management, filling the ministries with more technocrats rather than the ideologues that Ahmadinejad had put in place. Over the 8 years that Ahmadinejad was president, he disbanded many of the centers that were responsible for managing the economy in an objective and moderate way. In addition, he also promised to increase political freedoms, specifically freeing many of the political prisoners who had been detained following the 2009 post-presidential election fallout. And finally, of interest to most of us here, he has promised a more moderate foreign policy and engaging in a constructive dialogue with the West. But in the end, what kind of an impact can an Iranian president actually have? After all, the Islamic Republic is headed by an unelected supreme leader who commands the military and is the final arbiter of the national security issues. In addition, there are multiple power centers within Iran that a president will have to contend with in order to pursue policies that he is interested in. Today I'll talk about how Iranian foreign policy is formulated and what role the president can play in that. I'll also discuss past presidents' experiences, how they've been successful and influential, and how they have also faced challenges. And then finally close with implications for Rouhani's presidency for U.S.-Iran relations. Now this complicated and convoluted diagram is an example of the complicated and convoluted way that the Iranian regime is set up, how the Islamic Republic is formally supposed to operate. This is basically what happens when you take a European-style constitutional democracy and overlay it with a theocracy. So as you can see, there's a president, there's a parliament, but at the same time, there are also unelected clerical bodies, such as the Supreme Leadership, his office, Guardian Council, that spread their tentacles throughout the entire regime and cause complications and ambiguity about where power resides and what bodies are the proper bodies for implementing different policies. However, what is most important to focus on is, in fact, the informal power networks and the power distribution. That's where a lot of the decisions are made. Despite the supreme leader's title, he's in fact not all-powerful. He has to rely on multiple power centers, and he has to consider the interests of these different groups. In fact, a lot of his job insists on balancing many of these groups off of each other in order for them not to become too powerful to sideline him. These groups include family networks, political groups, different security networks in the military and the Revolutionary Guard, religious groups, and also economic and business groups. They operate often behind what Iranians call behind the curtain, or openly through their own political factions, which are very diverse and changing often. In fact, Iran does not have a political party system as we're familiar with. It's often changing and confusing even for the people within the government to find out who's on what side of the issues. One of the most important power networks at this time is the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which can be considered a super faction, which controls the military-industrial complex in Iran and has quite a say in the foreign policy and national security decision-making. And so for a president to be able to influence the supreme leader and pursue his own objectives, he has to compete with a variety of these interest groups. Now, how is foreign policy actually decided upon within Iran? As I mentioned before, it's influenced greatly by the different factional groups competing with each other. Prior to the time where the supreme leader sets out the overall agenda on a specific issue, there's a great deal of competition, and often it's played out in public through the various think tanks and media outlets that belong to the various groups. In fact, the current president, Rouhani, has for years been the head of a very influential think tank that deals with strategic and national security thinking. Media organizations, there are a number of different media outlets that are affiliated with various powerful individuals and are seen to be outlets for or representing their views. Certain important issues, such as the nuclear issue, for instance, are brought to the Supreme National Security Council for deliberation and final sending the consensus recommendation to the Supreme Leader. Now, the president is considered the chair of the group, but however, he only has one vote. He has to compete with members of the intelligence and security organizations, members from the Supreme Leader's office, the judiciary chief, the head of the parliament, and others who are specific to the issue. So in deliberations over the nuclear program, he has to also contend with individuals from the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization and other institutes affiliated with the nuclear industry. Now, once the Supreme National Security Council comes up with a consensus recommendation, they provide it to the Supreme Leader, and he almost always, in fact, approves. In very rare cases, he does not approve of their consensus recommendation. Now, why does he do that? He's a Supreme Leader after all. Why doesn't he just come up with the decisions himself and dictate it as a military dictator would? Well, as I mentioned before, there are numerous power centers that he has to contend with, and he wants to have as much consensus as possible so that when policy is pursued, there'll be less of a chance of groups trying to spoil the outcome. In addition, he's very uncomfortable getting in front of policy, getting in front of the standing out on his own or going out on a limb, because he does not want to be blamed for any foreign policy failures. He wants to be seen as being apolitical, non-political, seen as more of a moral guide to the Islamic Republic and not get involved in the daily political activities. Now, let's look at how the past presidents have performed in foreign policy and what we can learn from that. Despite these limitations that I mentioned before, a president can and has played an important role in foreign policy. The two factors that can impact the way how influential he is are the nature of his personality, which includes his use of rhetoric, how he uses his position as the public face of the Islamic Republic to influence both the domestic audience inside Iran and the international public. At the same time, the configuration of his power networks also influence how influential he could be. And what I mean by that is not only how strong his power networks are, but how broad they are, how far across the political spectrum they reach in order to include as many various groups as possible. Now, the first president to serve under the current supreme leader is Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who is very well known. He's considered to be one of the pillars of the Islamic Republic, close associate of the founder, Ayatollah Khomeini, and also he was a close associate of the current supreme leader during the revolution. He started his presidency, in fact, more powerful than Khamenei. This is because when the founder Khomeini died, Rafsanjani played an integral role in convincing the regime insiders to select Khamenei as the next supreme leader, despite the fact that Khamenei was considered a junior cleric. He wasn't an Ayatollah at the time. And so the current supreme leader really does owe a lot to Rafsanjani for his position. As a result of his power, when he became president, he had a good amount of leeway to begin with to pursue his own policy objectives. His main objective was to reintegrate Iran into the international community. This was a period following disastrous 8 years of war with Iraq, and he wanted to rebuild and reconstruct the country to attract foreign investment and businesses. In addition, he wanted to improve ties with the West. In 1990, a year after his election, he attempted to expand back-channel talks with the U.S. via the Swiss interest section in Iran. But unfortunately for him, especially by his second term, he had been overpowered by the supreme leader and his hardline opponents. Over this time, the supreme leader had gained his own independent power base, specifically within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and other hardline groups, and was worried that the Rafsanjani would be trying to sideline him by gaining more power. As a result, conservative media and other groups accused Rafsanjani and his allies of trying to sell out the revolution to the West. Following Rafsanjani was the famous reformist President Muhammad Khatami, who won his election in a landslide victory of 70%, winning 70% of the vote. And this shocked the conservatives. This was completely unfathomable to them that this would happen. And as a result, for the first year or so of his presidency, he also had a great deal of leeway in pursuing his own foreign policy objectives. His goal as well was to improve Iran's face in the international community. He pursued what he called a dialogue of civilization and wanted to engage in more constructive talks with the West. However, just as with his predecessor, Khamenei, the supreme leader, and his allies worried that the reformists would gain credit for any type of improvement in relations. So as a result, they sabotaged his diplomacy using various levers, including government-affiliated cultural institutions, security networks abroad, to pursue a more hardline policy to undermine the president's pursuit or attempt to show Iranian goodwill to the world. Following Khatami, and at a period when the reformists and their popular support was at a low point, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected in 2005. He was a relative unknown, and as a result, seemed to be very subservient to the supreme leader. He was considered for a long time to be the supreme leader's golden child, someone who would obey him and not challenge his power, who was allied with the Revolutionary Guards and the more populist Basij paramilitary forces. He was also very influential in shaping Iran's foreign policy through his rhetoric. Again, his personality was very influential. He domestically, he took a nationalistic approach to the nuclear issue. This is when we started to hear slogans about uranium enrichment being an inalienable right of the Iranian people. He would hold rallies, and as a result, really influenced public opinion to make the nuclear issue a very popular nationalistic issue, which in fact ended up boxing in a lot of other politicians who perhaps would be more willing to pursue a deal with the West. Now they would be seen as selling out the country. He also accused former presidents of doing so. At the same time, on the international stage, he engaged in very provocative anti-Western and anti-Israeli rhetoric, which we're all familiar with. And this influenced the world's opinion of Iran, and in fact played a large role in galvanizing Western powers to pursue more stringent sanctions on Iran. In fact, the toughest sanctions that the Islamic Republic had ever seen. However, just like his predecessors, Ahmadinejad eventually lost influence, also beginning to fight with the supreme leader and competing with him for power. Ahmadinejad attempted to pursue his own foreign policy with his own foreign envoys, and pursue national security policy outside of the more traditional ways that the Islamic Republic had operated before. And this worried the supreme leader, as well as other conservatives who had previously supported President Ahmadinejad. At the same time, the Green Movement protests that followed his disputed re-election in 2009 really shook the foundations of the Islamic Republic and was seen to be one of the greatest security challenges in the Islamic Republic's history. And in fact, this undermined his foreign policy as well in an interesting way, when in 2010 he surprised the world by reaching out to the West and attempting to engage in a nuclear fuel swap deal, where Iran would send some of its enriched uranium outside of the country in exchange for fuel for its research reactor in Tehran. But at this time, it was the reformists who spoke out against it and sabotaged the deal because they were afraid of Ahmadinejad and his hardline allies of gaining credit and becoming legitimized for achieving a breakthrough with the West over the nuclear program. Now, what does this all mean for the Rouhani presidency? What can we expect going forward? First of all, let's look at what his victory can tell us about the possible direction that the Islamic Republic will take in the future. First of all, his election shows that when given a chance among at least a limited amount of candidates, the Iranians will pick the most moderate candidate that was left in the race. As I mentioned before, this is not considered a free and fair election by international standards. The vetting process for candidates is very stringent in the Islamic Republic. They are judged by not only their religious conservatism, but by their past statements and perceived allegiance to the supreme leader himself. So as a result, many people are disqualified from even entering the race. And surprisingly, this year, former President Rafsanjani, who was trying to run, was actually disqualified because of his previous support to the Green Movement. But among the individuals who were allowed to run, Rouhani was definitely the most moderate. In the debates, in his campaign speeches, he would talk about moderate foreign policy, constructive engagement with the West, but also criticizing Ahmadinejad's poor management of the economy. As a result, he won 50.7% of the vote, which means that he won in the first round. Within the Islamic Republic, if you don't win over 50% of the vote in the first round, you go to a second round runoff with the second highest vote getter. In this election, it would have been Tehran Mayor Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf. Two of the reasons why Rouhani won, first of all, was the last-minute support that he received from former reformist President Khatami, as well as Rafsanjani, which galvanized voters who had been apathetic prior to that in a few days running up to the election. And secondly, he was helped out by his conservative rivals, who were fighting amongst each other and unable to coalesce around a single candidate. As a result, as you can see, the the vote was split between a number of candidates. The top two conservative candidates were the Tehran mayor, who had been considered a frontrunner, as well as the nuclear negotiator, who only received 11% of the vote. Now, why was this a relatively fair outcome? Why did the regime not tamper with the vote? As you can see, Rouhani only won in the first round by a very small margin. They could have tampered with it and forced it into a second round. But I believe that the Supreme Leader he was not interested in repeating what happened in 2009. His legitimacy and the Islamic Republic's legitimacy had greatly been damaged as a result of the protests. And also, he was interested in showing to the outside world, the international community, to portray Iran as a democratic country that has a legitimate government. And so he wanted to show a more moderate face to the world. Now, what are Rouhani's abilities to accomplish his goals? If we take him at his word, his campaign slogans at his word, will he be able to accomplish them? On the positive side, he has spoken a great deal about bringing in groups from across the political spectrum. He's spoken of himself as a non-factional individual. So although he's a moderate, pragmatic conservative, he plans on bringing more liberal people within his cabinet, as well as more of the hardliners, which can be beneficial to him, because it will decrease the likelihood of people attempting to sideline him out of fear that they will be left out of some type of breakthrough in the foreign policy realm. He is an insider, regime insider, which is also helpful to him. He has long been part of the national security establishment for a number of years, as well as the head nuclear negotiator from 2003 to 2005. He also has a good relationship with the Supreme Leader, and has been close to the Rafsanjani camp for a number of years. At the same time, however, he is going to face a number of challenges similar to his predecessors, specifically coming into confrontation with the Supreme Leader, which is inevitable, and this has less to do with the personalities than with the way that the Iranian government is structured. As we spoke about earlier, there's the president and the more democratic institutions competing with the theocratic dual nature of the Islamic Republic. And so inevitably, he will be coming into confrontation with the Supreme Leader. Also, early on, following his elections, conservative media have been pressuring him, including Kayhan newspaper, which is closely allied with the Supreme Leader, to not bring in any seditionists, which means former supporters or members of the Green Movement, into his cabinet. He also needs to overcome conservative opposition in the parliament in order to have their support for his appointees for his cabinet. On the other side, he'll also be receiving a lot of popular pushback from the more reform-minded voters who are expecting him to free political prisoners, including the former Green Movement figureheads Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi. In fact, if you look at the footage following the Rouhanis election and celebrations in the street, the majority of chants you hear are actually referring to the Green Movement and freeing Mir Hossein Mousavi and Karoubi, rather than chants in favor of Rouhani. He's actually his name does not come up as often as the Green Movement leaders, even in the celebrations following his own election. So these are two things that he'll have to contend with. An early way for us, early indications about both his intentions and his capability to pursue the objectives that he's stated he wants to pursue are the makeup of his cabinet. Yesterday he submitted his nominees for the cabinet to the parliament, and they have 10 days to deliberate over it and approve. According to the lists that have been made public, they represent members from across the political spectrum, as he had said before. For instance, the Interior Minister is more of a conservative. He's allied with the faction that is in the majority in the parliament, including the faction that's aligned with the parliamentary head Ali Larijani. And this is likely a result of backroom dealings in order to gain approval for his list of other candidates. On the other side is his foreign minister nominee is more aligned with the former reformists. He's in fact well respected among Western diplomats as the former ambassador to the UN living in New York. He was also instrumental in gaining the Islamic Republic's cooperation in the early days of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. And he also, things that I've read recently suggest that Rouhani is going to try to attempt to bring the foreign ministry, increase the foreign ministry's role in the nuclear negotiations, as opposed to focusing specifically, operating specifically through the Supreme National Security Council. Whether or not he'll be able to do this will be a good sign of how much leeway the Supreme Leader will be giving him to pursue his policy objectives. Some analysts are predicting that Rouhani is going to be giving in to conservatives on domestic issues in order to save his political strength for nuclear negotiations and convincing factions within Iran to allow him to give concessions to the West. The nominees for his cabinet definitely suggest that this is a possibility. What does this all mean for his ability to resolve the nuclear issue? I'm optimistic about at the current situation with Rouhani as president. If we think of former President Khatami as being the right person at the wrong time, unfortunately, domestically, and Ahmadinejad being the wrong person at the right time when it comes to Western outreach towards Iran, we can consider Rouhani to be the right person at the right time. He is uniquely qualified to address the nuclear issue as having been a former lead nuclear negotiator. He also has an unprecedented mandate to negotiate the nuclear issue. The discussion of the nuclear issue that occurred during the presidential debates was unprecedented in Iran. Up until then, the nuclear issue was seen as more of a national security issue that would not be discussed in public forums. But it was very it was very apparent that from going on forward that the nuclear issue would be more of a subject to popular debate. And so he has a popular mandate. He also, again, has close association with the Supreme Leader and was successful in persuading him to suspend uranium enrichment in 2004, which was the closest that the West and Iran have come to a breakthrough in the nuclear negotiations in past decades. And he's also well respected among his former Western interlocutors as a fair-minded and skillful diplomat. He's referred to as the diplomat sheikh. At the same time, however, we need to have realistic expectations in the West. No Iranian president, not even a reformist president or even a moderate one that such as Rouhani, will ever agree to permanently suspend uranium enrichment on Iranian soil. The Iranian government has spent too much both financially and politically in this program to be able to completely give it up. So we need to find a way for them to save face and allow intrusive inspections in Iran, but allow some type of nuclear enrichment to occur on Iranian soil. But as I said before, I'm optimistic in the current situation, but I don't think it'll last too long because, as I mentioned before, over time, conservative elements in Iran can become more powerful and try to sideline him or sabotage him. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali Scotten. And while our guests are typing their questions into the chat box at the lower portion of their screen, clearly this topic reaches far beyond just Iran. And to highlight that is Lieutenant Colonel Hansen's question that he's already typed in there. Do you consider the informal power, I'm assuming the structures and the influence in Iran similar to the ones that, like the shadow government that has been credited with helping to expedite the failure of the Morsi government in Egypt?
That's a very interesting question. I think it's there are some differences, and I'm not an expert on Egyptian politics, but it seems to me that the power structures within Iran are more dispersed. There are a lot greater variety of power networks than there are in Egypt. When we refer to the deep state in Egypt, we're really referring to the military itself, and a lot of the people that were involved, part of the former Mubarak government, and then competing against the Muslim Brotherhood. Whereas in Iran, we have a supreme leader, and who is his power base is comprised of members from the military, but also from religious groups, a lot of different economic power centers. So I think that's a big difference, is what makes Iranian government so confusing, even for the people within Iran, even politicians that are operating within the Iranian government, is that there are all these various power networks operating behind the scene, and as a result, it makes things very unpredictable.
Okay, thank you. And kind of take that just another step, just within Iran. Another one of our guests, Reg Denny, asks if isn't that really the point, that whether it's a subordinate cleric like Rouhani or a past performer like Khatami, that so far when the real power resides within the rule of a jurisprudent like Khamenei.
Well, yeah, I mean that's definitely a challenge, like I mentioned. But as I spoke about before, the supreme leader himself is not. It's not like a military dictatorship. You know, we can't think of it like, for instance, Iraq, where Saddam would make a decision and everyone would fall into step behind him. He has to take into account the interest of a large number of different groups, and so whenever the policies that Iran pursues, and whether foreign policy or domestic policy, are a result of consensus decisions. And so when you have a group that becomes a little more powerful, for instance, at this point in time, the pragmatic conservatives that are aligned with Rouhani or more of the Rafsanjani camp have become a little more powerful at this point in time. They have more influence in the foreign policy deliberation process. Now, the Supreme Leader himself has come out numerous times saying that he is distrustful of the West, that Americans are deceitful, and he's been saying this for a number of years, and I'm sure he believes that. But at the same time, he also, in his most recent speech, reiterated that he has not ruled out talks with the U.S. or anything, or any type of negotiation, as long as the West is respectful of Iran's rights. And so what that means is, what he likes to do is to distance himself from the actual nitty-gritty political debates, and act as more of like a religious leader in public. And so the position he's put himself now is to say, look, I don't think it's going to work, but if you want to try, you can do it. And if at some point he feels that the negotiations are going in a way that are a threat to him, he can say, look, I told you it's not going to work. I warned you. But if Iran does succeed and comes away with some type of concessions or benefits, then he can take credit for it as well.
Okay, and this next question came to us via email, and I'd actually like to tie that together with Major Murray's question. Given that Khatami's election and now Rouhani, does this actually indicate a popular turn from a more conservative Islamic leadership into more willingness to be more open to the West or to Western points of view? And if that's the case, or if not, how long before we can measure that level of influence? How can we measure that level of shift in the Iranian political situation?
Sure. I think that, we need to be realistic. We can't expect that the Iranian government is going to become, pro-Western, or the government, people within the government are going to start advocating more Western-style domestic situation. Rouhani is a conservative. He's not a reformist, even though he was supported by the reformist camp in the election. the reason they did that was because they were being pragmatic. They knew that if they supported a more liberal candidate, he wouldn't win. And so he's, domestically speaking, he's not going to be as open-minded as Khatami himself. He'll definitely free up the political situation within Iran to the point that it will stabilize the situation and will prevent protests and things like that. On the international scene, we've already seen statements from him that indicate a more moderate, constructive policy. He has made it a priority to improve, decrease tensions with Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf countries. And he's spoken again yesterday during his inauguration that he is interested in pursuing talks with the U.S. as long as Iran is, quote unquote, respected by them. And so, again, whether or not we could, the measure that, what measures, how we'll be able to measure it, one, again, is what his cabinet makeup is. Another is, will he actually be successful in freeing the political prisoners? Will he be successful in freeing Mousavi and Karoubi? That'll also be an indication of the type of, how much power he actually has within the regime itself.
And in speaking of political prisoners and opposition in general, what's likelihood that folks like the Green Movement leaders will be freed?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I was more optimistic, I think, until recently that they would be freed within the first 100 days or so of Rouhani's presidency. But looking at his cabinet makeup and going back to what I mentioned before, it seems like he is saving a lot of his political capital, so to speak, on trying to convince the conservatives to allow him to negotiate the nuclear issue. And as a result, he's giving some way on the domestic situation. And so his interior minister, who's in charge of the police, is more of a conservative. The person that he is recommended to be of human being complicit in human rights abuses in the past. So I'm not optimistic in the short term that they will be released, but at the same time, I think other political prisoners, more junior political prisoners, might be released as a way to placate some of his more reform-minded supporters.
And I see some more of our guests are typing in their questions. I had one that came across via email, and it's less of a what Iran's doing, what are we doing? In light of the president's statements regarding constructive dialogue with the West, the new president, what should be the next step from our end, and what does, in their view, what does constructive dialogue actually mean?
Sure. I think that President Obama's statement, the White House's statement yesterday following Rouhani's inauguration was good. It talked about constructive dialogue, and it is saying that if Iran is in fact interested in pursuing constructive dialogue, that they'll find a willing partner. But as many Western officials say about Iran, saying that we talk about how Rouhani makes these statements, but we want to judge him by his actions rather than his words. Well, the Iranians also say the same thing about the Obama administration. And so while he's made these statements, at the same time, the U.S. has increased sanctions pressures. And so just prior to the presidential election, the president signed a new executive order that sanctioned, for instance, the Iranian automobile industry, which employs over 500,000 Iranians. And that executive order actually went into effect after the election of Rouhani. At the same time, the House of Representatives a few days ago signed into law a new sanctions. The sanctions law that would increase pressure on the Iranian oil industry. And so if the point of sanctions is to gain leverage over the Iranians and to convince the Iranian people or the Iranian government to moderate their behavior, then it seems like it's counterproductive that once they do that, we'll be increasing pressure, because it really plays into the rhetoric of the supreme leader, who says that the nuclear issue and these sanctions are just an excuse, really, to overturn the regime. And so if they make at least some type of moderate move inside Iran and we continue to increase sanctions, I really think it undermines our leverage.
Okay, thank you. And I'm trying to read this question by Dr. Hassizian down here. It says, is it not true that those ministries are being selected by Khamenei and Rouhani do not have any role in their selection process? I'm not sure if I got that quite right.
Sure. The Rouhani does have a role, but there is a lot of backroom dealing going on, which is very common. This happens every time. The supreme leader definitely has a say, specifically in the security ministries, and so when it comes to economic issues, for instance, the oil ministry and Ministry of Economy, or domestic issues like the education department, Rouhani, he's going to have more of a free reign. But when it comes to, for instance, the intelligence ministries and the interior ministry, he's going to have to talk. He's been making deals, I think, behind the scenes with both the supreme leader and also the conservative establishment. But again, I think that even the supreme leader himself is interested at this point in gaining as much consensus as possible, bringing in as many different groups as possible into the cabinet to stabilize the situation, because there's been a great deal of infighting in the past few years, even among conservatives, that have been very disturbing to him. One ministry, again, that is very important, that I think that Rouhani is going to get his way on, is the foreign ministry, with potential foreign minister Zarif, who is more of a moderate. And so I think there's definitely going to be a back and forth, but Rouhani does have some say in some of the selections.
Okay, thank you. And while you're on the foreign ministry, that ties together nicely with Lieutenant Colonel Hansen's question coming up. So will the election of Rouhani drive any change in Iran's policy on actions in Syria? And if you'd like to expand on that to any of the other neighbors.
Sure, that's an excellent question, and I think that with the Syria situation, Rouhani, the Syria situation is really, I'd say, guided mostly by the Revolutionary Guards, especially the Quds Force, which is the expeditionary force of the Revolutionary Guards, and the president and his allies do have some say through the Supreme National Security Council, as I discussed, but I think in that specific realm, the Revolutionary Guards are the one that are driving that situation. The way that Rouhani can have an impact is through improving relations with Persian Gulf countries, for instance, Saudi Arabia. One of them, in his press conference that he gave following his elections, one of the things that he really focused on was improving relations with Persian Gulf countries, and especially mentioned Saudi Arabia as a country that he had helped to improve relations with when he was in the Supreme National Security Council previously. And what that would do is, if tensions decrease between Saudi Arabia and Iran, there might be some type of more of a potential or opening for the different proxy groups that each of them are supporting in Syria to at least improve the situation. So it's more of an indirect way that he can influence it rather than a direct way.
Okay, and one more big question here, and this is quite a bit. Let me see if I can go ahead and just read it for you instead of trying to parse it. Regina, it says, isn't another real difficulty similar to that famously noted by Condi Rice, where she noted how Iraqi Shia were playing the U.S. for suckers? That's Khamenei's desire to mollify populist sentiment while seeking to maintain a seemingly open hand in foreign policy, i.e. the open federal relations with the U.S., all while pursuing some undisclosed agenda. It highlights yet another example of Shia Tahiyya, not sure about that, This naturally assumes Iran's moves are more than nominally doctrinally driven, i.e., beyond rational geopolitical concerns. But how can any foreign power deal seriously with such an unknown commodity, particularly in light of the Iraq business, where it's now ruled by Iranian trained and guided Shia subordinates? Is the hesitancy among global powers to engage based partly on the reality on the ground?
Sure. I mean, the question of taqiyya is it's basically a Shia doctrine that allows for some type of deceiving or lying. Basically, it's religiously sanctioned lying in order to protect the Shia population. Now, I think that we definitely can't. The Supreme Leader has not shown obviously goodwill towards the West, and we can't just automatically take his statements, at face value. But at the same time, I think we're presented with a very promising opening with the election of President Rouhani, and the fact that he was allowed to become president, and after speaking so openly about a constructive dialogue with the West. But the way that we have to approach this is to the same way that we approached the Soviet Union. When we would say trust but verify, we can't trust them on the face of it, but through negotiations, more increased and intrusive inspections regimes, we can, I think, allay a lot of the international community's fears about what's going on the ground inside Iran, without just having to, take them on their word or their religious, when they say that the nuclear weapons are against Islam. We don't have to take them on their word for that. We need to create a situation where they would be willing to allow more increased inspections inside Iran, but at the same time save face.
Well, and on that, it sounds like you're starting to wrap it up. Do you have any other closing thoughts that you haven't covered in the rest of these questions?
I think those are basically my closing statements. Is that I am, at this point in time, I am optimistic, but as the Obama administration has also said numerous times, the open door is not open. It's not going to be open forever. Both from the U.S. side and the Iranian side, we both need to act quickly to take advantage of the potential opening for a peaceful resolution to the U.S. Iran standoff.